Thank you very much for joining us in this fourth talk from the Innova Webinars 2025. This is an event organized by the members of the Innova SPEC project, a transdisciplinary research project focused on innovations in communication in humans in other animals. This is the last of 4 very interesting talks that took place over the course of 2 weeks, with speakers from different countries on different themes in communication. Please follow our Instagram profile to get more information. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Philippe Schlenker. He's the Director of Research at the École Normale Supérieure, Institut Jean Nicode in Paris, and a Global Distinguished Professor at New York University. His recent work has focused on the semantics of sign languages, with particular attention to their logical structure and the rich iconic elements that interact with it. To provide a basis for a comparison with this iconic phenomena, he has also explored the logic and typology of gestures in spoken language. Additionally, through collaborative work with primatologists and psycholinguistics, he has helped to lay the foundations for a primate semantics, an approach that applies the tools of formal linguistics to the study of primate vocalizations. Dr. Schlenker, thank you very much for your presence here today. After your talk, we'll have 15 minutes to take questions from the audience. Everyone can ask questions through the YouTube chat, and questions can be in Portuguese. We'll select and send them to me. This event will be recorded and will be available through YouTube after the transmission. And with no more details, I'll give the word to Dr. Schlenker now. Dr. Schlenker, we will be here in the background in case of any technical problems.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and a true honor as well. My current affiliation is actually Institut Jean Nicode, CNRS, and I should say this is collective work. And so the first thing I should do is thank my really, really wonderful co-authors. If you are interested in the paper, it's available online on Linkbuzz, and it will appear shortly in the journal Linguistics and Philosophy. So what are the goals? I want to start from animal linguistics, which can be defined as the use of formal methods to analyze animal communication. And I will argue that recent animal linguistics has led to the beginning of a typology of meaning operations in animals. Now, extraordinarily, the form and meaning of some animal signals can sometimes be reconstructed over millions of years, and we can start combining the detailed analysis of contemporary systems with the reconstruction of ancestral systems and with evolutionary models of how meaning operations arose. That is the goal for today. So the plot is as follows. Animal semantics has 3 main components: elementary meanings, in some rare cases, some non-trivial combinations. To give you an example, Japanese tits have an ABC alert call. They have a D recruitment call. And Toshi Suzuki and his colleagues have argued at great length that they also have a non-trivial combination of ABC and D, which has a different meaning, namely that of a mobbing call. The third component are rules of competition. So often, you will find a species, for instance, in monkeys, that has a specific call. For instance, a call which is specifically used to warn of eagle presence. And they have a general alarm call as well. Well, under these conditions, if there is an eagle, even though they could in principle use the general call, they don't. And so there's a competition between the specific call and the general call, which has the effect that the specific call wins whenever possible. So these are the 3 main components that we have in animal semantics. Another take-home message will be that we can put constraints on how they arose in evolutionary times. And there will be certain non-trivial consequences of this. In particular, that some meanings proposed in the literature could probably not have gotten off the evolutionary ground, which means that the analysis that corresponds to these meanings might have to be corrected. So in greater detail, we'll be asking 3 questions. One is, how did the first elementary signals arise? So for instance, the ABC alert call in Japanese TIDS, or the D recruitment call in Japanese TIDS. The second question is, how did the first non-trivial combinations arise? So how was it possible for the ABCD combination with this distinct meaning of mobbing? How was it possible for it to arise? And how did principles of competition arise, of the sort that I just described? The principle that tells you if you have a general call and a specific call, if the specific call is applicable, that's what you should be using. So just so that you know where we're going, I want to sketch the main results. The first result is that the initial signals, the initial elementary signals, might have trouble arising. And that's a very old problem and a very old idea. And the intuition is this. Imagine that you have a group that doesn't use signals, and suddenly there appears a mutant that creates a new signal. Well, presumably the mutant will pay some price to use the signal. There could be a production cost, etc. But the signal will not be understood by others. So that is on the assumption that signals are completely arbitrary. And of course, what this leads to is the first result that I will develop. And again, this dovetails with the literature, that in order to solve this problem, new signals should to some extent be understood from the start, and or they should have a null cost. So that's the first idea. The second idea is that non-trivial combinations will have trouble arising as well. And that's for a related but slightly different reason. Suppose that you start using a sequence of calls, C and C prime, which is different from the conjunction of C and C prime. And when we say that the combination is non-trivial, all we'll mean is that you cannot treat C, C prime as the conjunction of 2 separate utterances. So by definition, non-trivial means has a different meaning from the a simple sequence of 2 separate utterances. And the problem is you have, in a way, the same kind of issue as with elementary signals. You have now a group of residents that use the calls C and C prime as independent, as separate utterances. And suddenly you have a mutant that starts giving the sequence C and C prime this new meaning, which is not reducible to C and C prime. Well, there will be miscommunication. And so we will get constraints from the fact that the initial non-trivial combinations that you have will give rise to miscommunication. And the third take-home message is that, by contrast, when it comes to pragmatic principles, there will be a clear path for their evolution. Specifically, they should arise in production first and in comprehension second. So now let me turn to elementary signals. The types of meanings that have been uncovered in work on animal communication and recent animal linguistics are of 3 types. So there are essentially examples of lexical semantics, whereby certain calls or gestures have a meaning roughly in the same way that human words have a meaning. They have, of course, completely different meanings, but there is a smallest unit, which is the call or the gesture, which seems to have what is as a first approximation, an arbitrary meaning. So, for instance, TT monkeys in Brazil use an A call for serious known ground threats, and they have a B call, arguably for general alarms. And so there is a kind of TT lexicon. Second component is an iconic sematics. So in animals, the most striking iconic system is the waggle dance of bees, which I will remind you of in a second. There are some ape gestures, such as, for instance, a beckoning gesture, which are iconic as well. And the third component, very interesting component in my view, could be termed a featural sematics. This works through the interpretation of designated acoustic features present in the signal. For instance, certain nonlinearities, a high frequency, a certain melodic slope. And multiple cases have been described, notably in birds, but also beyond. So these are three types of signals. So I want to now discuss some examples in greater detail. So the slide I have here pertains to potty-nosed monkeys. So some African monkeys that have a boom call, which is a non-predation call, a piao call, which is arguably a general alarm call, and a hack call, which is used for eagles. Interestingly, they have combinations as well. They can combine a small number of piaos with a small number of hacks, and this triggers group movement. This seems to have a completely different meaning from the meaning of piao and hack alone. Now, something extraordinary is that sometimes the evolutionary history of these calls can be reconstructed over millions of years. So this is the case of the boom call, which has been determined, so the non-predation call in potty-nosed monkeys has been determined to be, depending on the subfamily of African monkeys, this family is called Cercopithecines. Depending on the subfamily of Cercopithecines, the boom call existed 2.5 or 5 million years ago. Well, how do we know, you might want to ask? Well, we know by starting from phylogenetic trees established on the basis of DNA methods. So here you have a phylogenetic tree of the entire subfamily of Cercopithecines. You have towards the top, you have potty-nosed monkeys. And you can see that the entire subfamily has a most recent common ancestor that lived 10 million years ago. But if you go to the top family, which is highlighted in yellow, they have a most recent common ancestor that lived 2.5 million years ago. Now, what we did on this tree was that we highlighted those species that have a boom call. The boom call is highly characteristic. It's produced with air sacs. Its use is very different from that of other calls. And you can see right away that the entire subfamily at the top has booms. And so the most explanatory theory is that they all have booms because their most recent common ancestor 2.5 million years ago had booms as well. That's the logic. And that has been used for numerous other calls as well. Now we go to iconic sematics. So the most remarkable system of this kind is the waggle dance of bees, whereby bees crawl in these weird shapes, which you see on the slide here. And the waggle run, which is the part in the middle, is interpreted. How is it interpreted? It's interpreted because the direction of the waggle run gives you the direction of the food. The duration of the waggle run gives you the distance of the food, and the number of waggle runs gives you an estimate of the quality of the food. I'm simplifying a bit, but so that's a remarkable system in which you can see that in simple cases, what's called a horizontal dance, the dance directly points through its direction to the source of the food. Now, using the same phylogenetic methods, people have reconstructed the evolutionary history of the waggle dance of bees. And basically, Janssen, Price, and Grutter in 2015 argued that this waggle dance is approximately 20 million years old. So we have an extraordinary time depth, both in boom calls and in the waggle dance of bees. Finally, I come to featural sematics. This was motivated in particular because sometimes animals understand the calls of other species that are neither phylogenetically nor geographically close to them. So an example is that Nile crocodiles are attracted to infant hominid cries, and the intensity of the crocodile response depends critically on a set of specific acoustic features, so including deterministic chaos, etc. Now, a common hypothesis is that the reason there is this ability of some animals to understand other animals that they're not phylogenetically close to is that these different animals have converged on a system on which specific acoustic features are interpreted. Now, in the case of crocodiles, you could say, well, maybe they have basically lived enough near bonobos and chimpanzees and humans that they had an interest in understanding hominid cries. So you want kind of controlled experiments to show that genuinely there are individual features which are interpreted. Unfortunately, this is a logic that Blumstein and Requepé developed for marmot calls in a beautiful fashion. So what they did was they started from naturalistic marmot calls, which you have on the left. Then they inserted nonlinearities, so noise, within the call. That's what you have in the middle. And they used a control in which they inserted something else in the middle, namely silence. And the remarkable finding was that the target call with noise inserted in the middle was more effective than naturalistic calls or controls in reducing the amount of time devoted to foraging. So they were more alarming than these naturalistic or control calls, which really suggests that the mere insertion of noise in the middle of the calls increased the alarm function of the calls. So on nonlinearities per se, we don't really have information about how old they are, but there's a special case of nonlinearities, which is called roughness, which has been studied in great detail and in a beautiful fashion by Louis Carnal and his team. And here they find this feature of roughness in extremely different animals, such as otters, primates, and bats. So either this feature is extremely ancient, or there was an awful lot of convergent evolution, and both possibilities are live ones. Okay, so having sketched the landscape, I want to discuss how the first signals might have evolved. And so the old problem is that the first signals might have trouble evolving. You start from a group of residents that do not have any signal. Suddenly you have a mutant that creates a new signal. The mutant is going to pay a price when using the signal. So maybe the mutant needs to exert itself. Maybe it's going to become more conspicuous to predators. There's a cost associated to this. And so the problem is, if the signals are not understood at all from the start, and if they have a cost, you have a problem, which is that the mutant pays a price, doesn't get any benefit because the signal is not understood. So the mutant should not be able to invade the residence. In order to block this conclusion, you have to say that one of the two hypotheses is incorrect. Either new signals are to some extent understood from the start, or they have null cost. And this dovetails with very old ideas in literature, and they have also been developed by Scott Phillips and colleagues in 2012. Here, I want to use this to illustrate the framework, and this is now, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on the only formal part of this talk. For the rest, I will refer you to the paper. We adopt a framework having to do with evolutionary stability, going back to Maynard Smith and colleagues. And the idea is just this. You start from this group of residents, and you have a mutant showing up. There's lots of residents, there's very, very few mutants. So most of the interaction is between the mutant, which has a signal, so we call the mutant caller, and the residents which have no signal, we call them silent. Now, what is the condition for the mutant to start invading the residents? It should be that the utility derived by the caller, the mutant caller, is greater than the utility obtained by the silent resident. Now, because the mutant mostly interacts with residents, because there's just, there's lots of residents, there's just a single mutant. What this means is that the utility of the caller when interacting with silent has to be at least as great as the utility of silent when interacting with silent. That's essentially the condition that we're going to use. There's all sorts of refinements, but that's the basic idea. And now I want to compute what the benefits of interaction are. So BA is the full benefit of communication. So it would be a mutant interacting with another mutant. We assume that they both produce the call and they both understand the call. But that's not really going to be relevant here because the mutant will only interact with the residents. So what matters is the partial benefit of communication obtained by silent that receives a signal A from mutant. If there is no understanding whatsoever, then BA, that's what we call BA minus. The partial benefit of communication, if there is no understanding, is just 0. But there could be a little bit of understanding. That's what we want to derive. Now, the mutant gets a certain proportion of this benefit. So think in particular of a mobbing call. A mobbing call says, look, there's a predator here. I need help to mob the predator. Clearly, if I'm successful in calling a resident, I will get a benefit of communication as well. So alpha BA minus is the partial benefit of communication obtained by caller when the silent understands something of the signal, namely BA minus. C is the cost of signal production. And now we can see what happens. So we assume that the call, so first we need to derive the utility obtained by silent interacting with silent. Well, nobody calls, nobody understands anything, the benefit is 0. So that's very simple. Now we need to compute the benefit obtained by caller interacting with silent. Okay, so now there are 2 cases. In half of the cases, we assume that the person who has the information that allows them to call is silent. In the other half of cases, the person that has the information that would allow them to call is caller. When silent has the information, because they're silent, they don't call. No one gets any benefit. Benefit is 0. When caller has the information, caller calls, it produces this call A. And what does it get in return? It gets alpha BA minus, the partial benefit of communication, the part of the caller gets. Remember, BA minus is what silent, the benefit of silent understanding to some extent, and then to an imperfect extent, the call. Alpha BA minus is what a caller gets. Okay, now we want this thing minus the cost divided by 2. Divided by 2 because in half of the cases, the person in the position of transmitting the information is silent and it doesn't do anything. So the benefit gets 0. In half of the cases, color gets the information. So the total benefit for color is alpha BA minus minus C divided by 2. And you want this thing to be greater than what what silent gets. So now I have restricted attention to cases in which the call is true, because of course if the call is false, nothing happens, nobody calls. So restrict attention to cases in which the call is true. And we want alpha BA minus minus C divided by 2 to be greater than what silent gets as a benefit when interacting with silent, which is 0. And you end up with this condition at the bottom of slide 19, which is that alpha BA minus should be greater than C. And this is very easy to interpret. This means that the benefit of the interaction for caller should be greater than the cost for caller. And this makes a lot of intuitive sense. It should be the case that the mutant caller gets a net benefit from producing the call. Now we'll call alpha BA minus, we'll just call this B minus. So here I have just repeated when I had the polar cases, or that you will satisfy this condition if C is 0, or you will satisfy this condition if the benefit for caller of communication is significant. That means that despite the fact that silence has not evolved to understand the call, there should be some pre-comprehension benefit on the part of silent. And this dovetails with a very old idea, which I will now illustrate. Namely, that signals should to some extent be understood from the start. And I will discuss cases in which this might happen. So the case of booms, there's a possibility that they are understood from the start because the use of air sacs, the fact that they're very low frequency calls, makes it possible for them to advertise male presence. And so there might be something reassuring for the group simply because the voice of the dominant male is, the resident male is recognized, which would mean that even if the residents don't initially understand the details of the call that has been created by the mutant, they recognize the voice of an animal that they know, and this will have an effect. Now, so that would be a case in which there's some pre-comprehension benefit of the call. The second case, the case of the waggle dance of bees, is very interesting because several researchers, including Menzel and von Frisch, have argued that animals that do not have a waggle dance in the sense of a communicative system still display a dance after finding food for whatever reason. Maybe they're happy. And this means that the dance might have evolved for independent reasons. In other words, the waggle dance plausibly arose independently of communication. And that is the second case we discussed, not the case in which there's necessarily a pre-comprehension benefit, but the case in which the signal initially had null cost, which means it evolved for other reasons. The case of nonlinearities is presumably a case in which the pre-comprehension benefit, what I call alpha BA minus, what I now call B minus for simplicity, is high. And there's a very natural reason for this. It's hard to habituate to basically nonlinearities. That might make these calls particularly salient, possibly aversive, and this might account for their alarm function even before animals have evolved to understand a call. The case I wanted to discuss as well, because it's very striking, is the case of ape gestures. So you have an arm movement that you see displayed in B. This is used to invite typically a juvenile to climb on the signaler. And you can see that these are arguably ritualized gestures. These are the beginning of an action to help the juvenile climb. And this gives you a clue as to how the signal could be understood from the start, even for animals that have not evolved to understand it. Now, I want to turn to combinations and their evolution. And I will remind you of certain debates in the literature, and I will tell you how we can use the same framework inspired by Maynard Smith to actually put constraints on the initial combinations. So, partynose monkeys, as I mentioned, have pyaos, which function as very general calls. Hacks function as eagle calls. But a small number of pyaos followed by a small number of hacks are predictive of group movement. There have been two main theories in the literature. Arnold and Suberbuehler claimed that basically pyaw hack sequences are like idioms. They are like kick the bucket, which means die, even though it has nothing to do with the kicking and nothing to do with a bucket. And they said, well, these sequences have syntactic structure, but no semantic structure. And I want you to notice that the meaning of pyaw hack sequences, namely, we are moving, or the group is beginning to move, seems to have nothing to do with the meaning in particular of hack as an eagle call. The second theory was that, in fact, these involve what is called trivial compositionality. Trivial compositionality just means pyaw is an independent utterance, hack is an independent utterance. You get the conjunction of the two. What the alternative said is that the meanings are weaker than what they seem to be. And crucially, they are enriched in some cases by way of certain competition principles. I'm not going to tell you how. This would be a separate presentation, but I just want to note that there's this debate between theory 1 and theory 2, and theory 1 says these are non-trivial combinations, in fact, so non-trivial that the meaning of the combination is unrelated to the meaning of its parts. A second case is the case of Japanese tits. So Suzuki and colleagues have argued that the ABC call is an alert call. The D call is a recruitment call. But the ABCD call has a different meaning, namely something like let's mob a predator. There are very sophisticated arguments by Suzuki and colleagues to argue or show that this is not a case of trivial compositionality. This is non-trivial compositionality in the sense that they argue you cannot treat this as just the combination of two separate utterances, one of A, B, C, and the other one of D. Here too, we can reconstruct the evolutionary history of some of these sequences. In fact, there's a paper by Salis and colleagues which argues that ABCD type calls, which are called by Salis FD calls, are at least 11 million years old. And now I want to ask how these non-trivial combinations could arise. And the problem is this: a non-trivial combination of AB, meaning, and I will call this meaning A star B. A star B could be anything which is not conjunction. It could be an idiomatic meaning where A star B has no relation to A and B, or it could be a compositional meaning which is just different from conjunction. So that's the problem. We have a non-trivial combination. We have AB, and the meaning A star B has to compete with the trivial understanding of two separate utterances. And of course, when you have two separate utterances, you just get the conjunction of them. That means that if you have a group of residents that only use trivial combinations and a mutant that suddenly innovates and produces and understands AB not with the meaning of A and B like the residents, but with the meaning A star B, the mutant will create misunderstandings. And so the upshot will be that this misunderstanding should be outweighed by an advantage when both A star B and A and B are true. Okay, so in greater detail, here's how this will work. You have a population of residents, which we'll call trivial because they go by trivial compositionality. And they use a sequence AB with the meaning A and B, just trivial. There's an occasional mutant, which we call combinatorial, that starts using AB with the meaning A star B. Could be an idiomatic meaning, could be something else. The important thing is that it's different from AB. Problem, they mostly interact with residents and create misunderstandings. Okay, that's the problem. Now we want to look in greater detail. So when the initial meaning A and B and the new meaning A star B have different truth values, it is very clear that mutants create disutility. They create misunderstanding. One of the calls is true, one interpretation is true, the other interpretation is false, disaster. When both meanings are false, well, nobody calls, so you don't need to worry about this case. When the meaning A and B and the meaning A star B are both true, trivial always understands AB as A and B. Combinatorial sometimes understands it as A star B. And so now, crucially, it should be the case that there is an advantage to the new meaning in this case, because otherwise you will never outweigh the disutility created in the first case. And so that's the upshot. There should be cases in which the two meanings are true and the new meaning gives you an advantage over the old meaning. Okay, and so now we can apply this framework to the case studies that appear in the literature. Piao-Hack sequences. Well, the trivial compositional meaning, which treats Piao and Hack, or Pia, 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 Hack, 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 it makes no difference, as just a combination of separate utterances, gives you the meaning there is an alert and there is an eagle. There is an alert because of Piao, there's an eagle because of Hack. And so, of course, you just get the inference that there's an eagle. Piao star Hack, that's the new meaning, which according to Arnold and Zuberbuehler is the idiomatic meaning. And it has nothing to do with the initial meaning. It means that our group is moving. But that's now a disaster, because what we saw on the previous slide is that there should at least be some situations in which both meanings are true and the new meaning has an advantage. But in fact, very likely you will never find a case in which there's an eagle and this group starts moving. Why? Because if monkeys move, they will be easier to spot for the eagle. And so these are two incompatible meanings. That means that the situation in which the new meaning could arise just could not hold. So the new meaning could not get off the ground. That indirectly might provide an argument for the alternative analysis that tells you that no, Piao-Hack sequences are not based on an idiomatic meaning. Then there is a second case study. The second case study involved ABCD sequences in Japanese states. And so here there has been a proposal that my team made in the journal Biological Reviews, which said that this is a case of non-trivial compositionality, where the meaning of ABCD is related to the meaning of ABC and the meaning of D. And to cut a long story short, on this analysis, ABC meant there is something that licenses an alert. D meant there is something that licenses recruitment. And of course, if you take these two things as separate utterances, you get what you have on the slide. There is an X which licenses an alert, And there's a Y which licenses recruitment, and there's no information that it's the same X that licenses both an alert and recruitment. These are separate utterances of A, B, C, and D. And the claim was that the non-trivial compositional meaning, the meaning that Suzuki and colleagues argued for, is a slight departure of this, but it's a stronger meaning. It's a more informative meaning. It tells you that the X and the Y have to be the same. So it tells you for some X, X licenses an alert, and the very same X licenses recruitment. And now when you look at the details, this has exactly the right form for this meaning to get out of the ground. The new meaning, A, B, C star D, is compatible with the old meaning. And furthermore, it could be advantageous. Why? Because when you know that there is something, that one and the same thing licenses an alert and licenses recruitment, it's going to be kind of faster to zero in on the predator to be mobbed than the separate utterance meaning, A, B, C, and D, which just tells you there is some X that licenses an alert and there is some Y that licenses recruitment. And I'm not telling you whether it's the same animal that licenses both. So the second case study is, in a way, the converse of the first case study. The first case study was suggested that the idiomatic meaning could not have arisen on evolutionary grounds. The second case study suggests, by contrast, that the new meaning could very well have arisen on evolutionary grounds. I want to discuss a third case study, which is something that, in a way, we don't find in nature. We don't find negation in nature. We find a head shake used to prevent the recipient from engaging in a particular behavior. That is in bonobos. Patel, Gross, and colleagues have analyzed similarly a chimpanzee gesture that could be taken to mean stop that. Now, that's not negation yet, right? Because this does not combine with another signal to give you, the negation of that signal. Now, D'Autriche and colleagues have argued that in artificial learning experiments, baboons can learn negation. So you might say, oh, wait a minute, you have something that looks like negation, which is the head shake in bonobos. We have other primates that can learn in an artificial language experiment the meaning of negation. How come animals don't seem to innovate something where not P means the negation of P? Well, you can use the framework that I just outlined to explain this. Just take something that means you shouldn't do that and P. Oops. You shouldn't do that and P. Well, the problem is this thing still entails P. And there will simply be no situation in which the new meaning, which will be not P, will be compatible with that situation. So the problem is that the new meaning, not P, is just incompatible with the old meaning that you get by trivial compositionality, where you take you shouldn't do that, P, as separate utterances. And of course, the reason is that not P is the opposite of P. And so there is no situation in which both are going to be true. But the very reason we outlined for a non-trivial combination to get off the ground was precisely that there should be cases in which the old meaning and the new meaning are both true. So finally, the upshot at this point is that this evolutionary framework has some bite. You can apply it to combinations that have been posited in the animal literature, Pierre sequences, ABCD sequences. And it's going to do some work. It's going to argue for some analyses and against others. And you can potentially even use this framework to explain why negation did not arise in animals. Finally, I want to come to competition principles. So let me just zero in on one competition principle, which is called the informativity principle. I introduced it at the outset. If you have an eagle call and a general call, and there's an eagle showing up, even though in principle you could use the general call, you don't. You go for the specific call, which is the eagle call. And so more generally, what the principle says is that if C prime is strictly more informative than C, and both are true, you should use the more informative call, namely C prime. And this has been argued to exist in several species, in particular in monkeys. Okay, so to show you an example of where this does some real work, it was found that Campbell's monkeys have a crack call in the Thai forest, which is used for leopards. They have a hawk call, which is used for eagles. But then on Tiwai Island, the crack call, which is used for leopards in the Thai forest, is used for eagles. The Tiwai Island happens to be an environment in which there are no leopards. And to cut a long story short, the theory that was proposed, which I cannot argue for here, is that the crack call is all over the place, a general alarm call, but it interacts in a sophisticated way by way of the informativity principle. So it's a general alarm call. It interacts with crackoo, which is a non-serious alarm. It interacts with hawk, which is an aerial alarm. And you regain the meaning, the leopard meaning of crack that you get in the Thai forest simply by competition. So crack is used. It could not be an aerial alarm, so it has to be a ground alarm. It could not be a non-serious alarm because it competes with crackoo, so it has to be a serious alarm. And a serious alarm, which is a ground alarm, basically will correspond to leopards. So this is just an example in which the informativity principle can do a lot of kind of non-trivial analytical work. And now the question is, how do competition principles in general and the informativity principle in particular arise in evolution? And what we show in the paper is that there's a very clear evolutionary path for these competition principles, for pragmatic principles in general, if they arise in production first and in comprehension second. And I will spend the last couple of minutes to explain the idea. So assume that they arise in production first. So concretely, what this means is that there's a mutant that has the general alarm call and it has the eagle alarm call, but in a way it's smarter than the residents in the sense that the residents, when there's an eagle, they sometimes dumbly use the general alarm call. The mutant only uses the eagle alarm call. Now, this is allowed by the system. There is no misunderstanding which is created. The residents initially understand the general call. They initially understand the eagle call. The only question is whether they apply the informativity principle. The mutant applies it, and presumably it only creates greater utility because it gives more useful information at the first step, because the residents will know right away that there's an eagle around. So that's good. And so that means that the informativity principle can arise in comprehension. One has arisen in comprehension. So now we assume we start from a different group, a group of residents which are smart in production, but not in comprehension. So we're assuming that the principle arose in production first, and we're asking whether it will arise in comprehension. I hope I didn't misspeak before. So we have residents that apply, they go by the informativity principle in production. So when there's an eagle, they only use the eagle call. They don't use the general call. But in comprehension, they don't make use of this, right? And so suddenly there's a mutant that is smarter than the residents. It's like the residents. It uses the informativity principle in production, but on top of this, it starts using the informativity principle in comprehension. And remember, the residents already applied the informativity principle in production. So the mutant is perfectly attuned to what the residents do, right? So that means that what the mutant can do is that when it hears a general call, because it kind of knows that the residents go by the informativity principle in production, it can infer that there is no ego. So it infers something useful from the use of a general call. It infers that there is no ego. And again, this is useful information. And so that means that the informativity principle will arise in comprehension after it has arisen in production. If I had more time, I would argue that if you look at a different ordering, if you assume, for instance, that the informativity principle arises in comprehension first, and in production second, it will create all sorts of misunderstandings, and so the trade-offs will be very complicated. So what do I want you to remember from this presentation? The first signals have trouble arising because of this general framework of the residents not understanding the signal that the mutant innovates. And so they should have non-positive cost or be natural enough so that they can be partly understood from the start. This seems to have some bite in real systems. Each case seems to arise in some natural systems, and this dovetails with very old intuitions in the literature. Non-trivial combinations compete with trivial combinations, and they must be at an advantage when both are true, and this puts certain interesting limits on the non-trivial combinations that have been described in the literature. And finally, there's a clear evolutionary path for pragmatic principles. They should arise in production first and in comprehension second. The next step will be to continue to combine these results with a reconstruction of ancestral signals. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Schlenker. That was very, very good presentation. We have some questions from the chat. We're going to start with the first one from Erika. You can see it on the screen, but I'll say it out loud. What do you think was the extent of the impact or the selective pressure imposed by interactions with interspecific signals, predators or competitors, on the evolution of semantics in animals?
Okay, this is an excellent question, and you need to refine the framework to take this into account. I want to say the framework that we used is a framework I like because it's analytically very, very simple. I mean, you can do it with basically high school mathematics, and it's very transparent. But of course, it's super restricted. You know, we really look at super simplified situations. For instance, residents initially have no signal, and we ask about the very, very first signal that arose. To answer the question, we need to consider a more sophisticated framework, and it's very likely that in some cases, interspecies comprehension played a role in the emergence of some signals. So basically, what they would do is they might strengthen the naturalness requirement on signals, because in some cases they would have signals that are under, I mean, it depends on the case. When it's cooperative, when you're mobbing a predator with the help of other birds, other species of birds, which happens, then you will have an advantage to having the signal understood by the other birds. When you are trying to get the signal not to be understood or heard by the predators, then it's the other way around. So you have to look case after case. You're going to have different cases, but that should play a huge role. And I should say, in the case of featural communication, it is absolutely possible that the reason featural decoding or featural semantics arose is not just because this was a way to ensure that certain signals could be understood from the start. It could very well be that interspecies comprehension played a key role. That makes excellent sense. You need a more sophisticated framework than we have used.
Thank you. We have a second question from Erika. Can we expect that non-trivial composition communication evolves with the changes of the environment?
So that is a possibility. So you might basically expect that the reason a new meaning becomes useful is because the environment changes. I think you would still have the issue that we raised, that the new meaning would compete with the old meaning. And so the new meaning will have to have some advantage. But one possibility is that the reason it has an advantage is that the environment changed. But it's not clear to me that this will necessarily change the framework. But I would need to think more.
Okay. Then we have a two-parter question from Eloisa. When you're studying vocalizations or gestures in animals like monkeys or even like birds or whales, what approaches do you find most trustworthy for figuring out what these signals actually mean? And how do you make sure, this is on the second part, and how do you make sure you're not projecting human traits?
So let me answer the first part. I mean, there's really two issues. One is to find the right systems for study, and that's hard. You want systems which are sufficiently non-trivial that you can say something interesting about them, but you don't want systems that are so complicated that they're beyond the limits of our current comprehension. Once you have done this, you do two things. I mean, you look at rich observational data, but what is really gold in this business is to have field experiments. Because with observational data, it's very hard to know what happens. There could be lots of things happening at the same time in the field. And field experiments, whereby you hide loudspeakers and you play back calls, or you play back animal sounds, eagle shrieks, leopard growls, or animal models that you can, visual models that you can hide. This is gold because this really helps you zero in on what happens. And this is really the one of the, this is really the craft of ethologists working on animal communication. And we as linguists, of course, depend on them to do this. Now, the second question is, how do we make sure that we don't project human meanings to them? I think there are two answers to this. One is, if you have a highly theoretical approach and you're really thinking in terms of the simplest meanings that you can posit, very often, and at least in the work that I know, you don't posit human-like signals. You posit very abstract meanings. So for instance, the kinds of meanings that you tend to posit are things like, there's a general alert, or there's a serious non-ground threat. And the reason you don't go out of your way to posit very complicated human-like meanings is that they just don't explain the data in a conspicuous fashion. Now, the second part, I think, of the answer is, in a way, create the theory with any means you have and let the theories compete, right? So if you want to be inspired by what happens in humans, please go ahead, come up with a theory. I just think that chances are this will be a theory that does not win against competitors, in particular, when you take the simplicity and the predictions into account. So I'm not super worried about this. I understand that the worry could arise. I think that you have to use imagination in order to come up with the simplest theories. But once you do it from a very theoretical perspective, and if you have enough imagination, and of course that's hard for all of us, we could be limited by our imagination, which is an indirect way to say that we are limited by our human biases. But I think at the end of the day, you will at least be in a position to overcome these things, hopefully.
Yes, I think that's a worry that appears more between who works with humans and then start looking at animals than who is already used on working with animals. I think we have time for one more question. Patricia. The idea of ancestral meanings suggests an evolutionary lineage of cognitive representation. Can this approach reshape classical debates in the philosophy of language?
So there's several things to say about this. So I think the definitely even just animal linguistics applied to contemporary species, I think, should reshape certain debates in the philosophy of language, broadly conceived, so that you understand language to be basically communication systems. Because really the problems and the solutions are mostly new, and they're not taken into account by a traditional philosophy of language, even though there's very good philosophy on signaling systems. There's formal philosophy, this simulation-based philosophy. Brian Skerms did very, very important work on the evolution of signals. My colleagues, co-author Shane Steiner-Threlkel, does wonderful work on these things. And this is genuinely coming from philosophy, but not so much it's more like formal philosophy than the philosophy of language narrowly conceived. And the second issue is, what about the ancestral meaning aspect of this? So yes, I think basically the question of the very first meanings and how they arose is something which is of broad, hopefully foundational interest, or so I hope. I may be wrong. And the reconstruction of these meanings should be of interest as well. Now, notice I said nothing about the origins of human language. What is striking is that we can perform, sometimes very easily, extraordinary reconstructions of animal languages, right? 5 million years, 11 million years for ABCD calls in Japanese states, 20 million years for the waggle dance of bees. When it comes to human language, I mean, what happens a few 100,000 years ago is totally up for grabs. And, people might have very strong views. The problem is that different people have different strong views. Whereas, in the cases I discussed, it's almost trivial. Once you have the data and the DNA-based phylogeny to reconstruct these things. So we should absolutely say things, hopefully of foundational interest about these animal languages, but this is a far cry from saying anything of foundational interest about human languages, because a lot more work is needed to apply these techniques to human languages.
Yes, and actually this is what a branch from our group is trying to start doing. It's actually working alongside animal communication and human communication and trying to see if one area can contribute to the other, because
Wonderful.
So I think this is it. We don't have time for any more questions, but everyone in the chat is thanking you for the amazing presentation. It was
Thank you for your patience.
good.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody for the wonderful, wonderful questions, and thanks for your interest.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schenkler. And with this, we conclude our 2025 webinars. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and it will be available on YouTube to watch later if you want. Thank you.